A good place to start the story of a garden is with springtime, with seeds and new beginnings. But once you've been in a spot for a couple of years, you realize life is not a straight line with a beginning, middle, and end. And so it is with the garden. So let's start even before the new beginnings, with a bit of a look at what has overwintered and is coming back this year. We'll start at the back porch with a few of the berry bushes. The 2 honeyberries are leafing out nicely. These are a relative of honeysuckle that produces an edible, elongated, blue-colored berry. Here is a bush cherry that actually decided to flower despite its still diminutive size. Not a true cherry, but a close relative of both cherries and plums. The second one might be a slightly different species, but the same idea. On the other side of the path, 5 very tiny blueberry bushes are still looking dormant but alive, bracketed by 2 actual cherries, sour cherries of the Montmorency and North Star varieties. The buds on these are definitely swelling, though it looks like the farther one needs a trim. One of the center branches didn't make it, and some of the others are too dense. There's a few spring bulbs planted in between it all, and volunteer flowers popping up, either naturally or from long ago plantings by former gardeners. Taking the gate toward the front of the house, we pass my flower nursery bed. Here, in a sheltered spot on the western wall of the house, I put more bulbs and any small plant gifts I receive. There's lilies coming up, a sedum, some Star of Bethlehem, tons of bleeding hearts and daylilies, as well as the tulips and daffodils I added. A little stand of pink hyacinths shows through the branches of the awakening beauty bush. Next we walk to the front yard. On the side of the driveway, the buds on the 2 persimmon trees are still tightly furled. Last year these guys were among the last to leaf out at the end of May. But the ones on the apple, this one is a French heritage variety called Calvel Blanc d'Hiver, are much more encouraging. The tree was planted exactly a year ago and arrived trimmed to fit the shipping box both on top and on bottom, so I'm glad it has recovered from the loss of its top and a portion of the root. A little further on, a second apple tree fares more modestly. This one is a Honeycrisp and was purchased at a smaller size, so should have acclimated easier since it didn't have to be trimmed, but it looks like the deer have been trimming it over winter and took most of the terminal buds. Brave little tree is still putting out leaves, but we need to fence those deer out before it gets any worse. Back toward the garden, I was gifted some tiny little red raspberry plants last spring. Here they are, leafing out merrily in their freshly mulched row. Hoping for some growth from these this year now that they've acclimated. In a big tub, 3 horseradish roots are also sending out new leaves, though the young growth is so dark as to be nearly invisible against the soil. These are staying in the tub because horseradish tends to spread uncontrollably if let loose in a garden. We're trying to learn from the mistakes of others and not cause ourselves a huge headache later. Inside our garden fence, just a few bamboo staves with a couple of cross pieces, the first thing we come to is the strawberry bed. I did, as the name suggests, overwinter them under a few flakes of straw, and that worked amazingly. Even when the ground was frozen, you could peek under the straw and see green leaves, and even once in February, a tiny greenish flower. Now I've opened the straw up for each plant, and they look fantastic. The next bed, also a Hügel, or hill in German, is among other things my herb bed. 2 kinds of thyme, oregano, and 2 kinds of lavender were here, also covered with a straw blanket. All but the curly lavender have thrived, but perhaps it got just too cold for this poor plant. Parsley is coming back on the cooler back side of the hill, probably from the root, not quite trimmed by bunnies. A few chives here and there from when I split an enormous clump of them last year. I'm hoping to also see some dill and sweet peas here climbing the trellis. A step farther, and we see the first 2 beds this garden ever had. half size compared to the rest, and now devoted to small quantity or experimental planting. The eastern one has a few strawberries coming back. Some of these were supposed to be pine berries, those fancy yellow-colored strawberries. We'll see what we get. Asparagus and rhubarb planted in this bed as well did not take too well, and may come back later with a small shoot or may just not. This was also where my huge clump of chives was, and I did poke a few plants back in here as well. They make good companions for almost everything. On the other short bed, 2 pretty sets of leaves are showing green. These are 2 of last year's parsnips left in the ground in order to go to seed. There were 3 originally, but when we came to assess the garden in March, our 6-year-old excitedly pulled one out, so we had to eat it. Parsnips, like many root crops, are a biennial. They grow the tasty root in the first year to store nutrients. Then they use them up, if we don't eat them, the second year to grow a flower stalk, bloom, and set seed. And finally, my root crops bed from last year. If I'm lucky, a few carrots and beets may also be left in this bed to go to seed. But if not, I bought plenty for this year. What is definitely still here is the leeks. Though we can see the bunnies did quite a job on them over the winter, the frost and snow is not affecting them at all. Not as big as in the grocery store, but green and happy. That about concludes the tally for our overwintered plantings. Next time we'll take a look at some of what's getting planted anew this year.